The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
The speed with which the Biden administration sought to dispel any last vestige of President Donald Trump has unsurprisingly backfired. Whether it was doing the Afghan withdrawal his own way, building back better, or dealing with the southern border, the disasters just keep piling up for a president who may have become too toxic for the 2022 midterms. With pressure mounting, can Joe Biden save his party, his presidency, and by no means least the country, before he becomes overwhelmed with political trauma? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we'll be figuring out why no heads have rolled over the Afghanistan withdrawal and why Joe Biden fails Economics 101. We'll also be examining the disaster down south and seeing whether it's high noon for the Supreme Court. I'd just like to take a moment to send a very special hello to our listeners out on KXYL in Brownswood, Texas on 1240 AM and 102.3 FM. Thank you for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. The fallout from the Senate Armed Services Committee hearings has been a mixed bag, to say the least. With both Senate Democrats and the Fourth Estate running cover for President Biden, it seems that there will be accountability for all, except perhaps for those actually involved. Now it's business as usual in the swamp, and as we all know, the swamp protects its own. Well, here to help us find the cracks in the facade and figure out exactly what was not said out loud, we're joined by retired U.S. Air Force pilot, author, and former Deputy Undersecretary for Defense Controller, Dave Patterson. Welcome back to the show, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be with you.
So, Dave, you watched the Senate hearings. We had the Democrats trying to run cover for Joe Biden and the military chiefs trying to tell us that there was no blame at all. What's your analysis?
Well, I think that it kind of falls into roughly four categories. First of all, Senator Reid, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee now, kind of set the stage when he explained that most everything that has followed from the flawed Doha agreement that was signed back in February of 2020.
So let's just keep score. Let's just keep score on this. That's one blaming for Trump, right?
That's one blaming for Trump. Exactly right. But it doesn't stand much scrutiny because the Biden administration has not hesitated to repudiate any of the other things that Trump put into being. And so consequently, why should they fall on their sword on this one? Well, it's because it's easy to blame the former president. And so they do. I think from a larger perspective, something that I refer to as the eaches has been significant in the fiasco that has been this withdrawal and evacuation. And what I mean is that with each small decision the Biden administration made, they foreclosed other options, both by their own choice and by virtue of the decision. For example, when Biden established the date certain for the withdrawal, originally 9/11, but politically that was too obvious, and revised it to 31 August, that drove the scramble to get out of Afghanistan by that date. It could have been any other date, but 31 August foreclosed a number of options for them. Also, when they withdrew the close air support from the Afghan security forces, that left the Afghans without the capability to engage the Taliban as they had been for the last 20 years.
It seems that the Biden administration is incapable of playing the Monty Hall game.
Exactly right. And, you know, when they decided to close Bagram Air Base, they foreclosed options for two bases from which to withdraw their forces and the Americans. So I think that with each of these small decisions, they contributed to the overall fiasco that turned out to be the withdrawal and evacuation.
Presumably one of these small decisions also involved the amount of troops to be left there. And one of the most notable points from the hearings was that either the attendees were lying or the president was, regarding recommendations to keep more troops on the ground or for how many troops to keep on the ground during the withdrawal. How to make sense of that contradiction?
Well, I think that when you listen to President Biden, for the most part, he will always say that he listened to his generals and he got advice from all of them, and is not always as forthcoming in saying, I took that advice, because obviously he did not. And for all of the former president's failings, one of the things I think that you can say is that when the military gave him options, he chose one. And then that became the policy. But when they became vehement about a choice, he generally followed their advice. And but this president doesn't do that.
Okay, now I think one of the few concrete statements that came out of the whole affair is that Democrats want to start up a long-ranging commission to examine every aspect of the 20-year engagement from the start to the finish. Now, I may be showing my political naivety here, but in real terms, does this mean just to shove it down the road and fill it so filled with paperwork that no real answers will ever be forthcoming?
Mark, in the swamp, there are two ways in which you minimize the impact of events. One is to make it so small that nobody cares much about it. The other is to make it so large that no one can get their head around it. And that's what they have done with this idea of the large omnibus look at 20 years of Afghanistan.
I mean, for 20 years worth of data at the highest level of governments, this is years upon years of work and potentially millions of pages of reports that it's, as you say, that it's making it so big that nothing can be taken out of it. Now, Dave, we hear about the word accountability, and we heard that at the hearings more times than I could really count. Now, in your opinion, will anyone ever actually be held accountable for the mess? And if so, will it only be at the ballot box?
I imagine that in the end that someone will be held accountable for some small portion of this overall travesty. But in the end, in a democracy, you make your point at the ballot box for sure. And I think that when you look at how the Biden administration deals with just about every issue, they provide you with this logical fallacy called the false choice. And the false choice at Bagram, for example, was, well, once we went below 2,500 people, we just couldn't use Bagram anymore as a base. Well, who made the decision to go below 2,500? You did. You could have changed that. And so whenever you hear Biden say, well, if we didn't get out of Afghanistan when we did on the 31st of August, we would have been there for 20 years. Really? I don't think so. So you have to be aware that that's how they govern. They govern by the logical fallacy of the false choice.
Now, Dave, one final question, if I may. I think it's apparent that the media is only too happy to go along with bolstering these false choice fallacies that you mention. Now, when the Fourth Estate refuses to hold feet to the fire, as is their purpose, what alternatives are left? How can folks sift the fact from the fiction?
Well, unfortunately, in the United States, we're experiencing a phenomenon where our Fourth Estate has become a fifth column. And quite frankly, you have to be very careful about who you listen to, and it drives the American public to do much more of the analysis themselves and dig into the issues. unfortunately, we're left by progressives with an education system that doesn't always value that.
Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark. Always good to be with you.
Now, don't go anywhere. Later in the show, we'll be talking about the perils facing the Supreme Court this term on our Talking Liberty segment. But before that, after this short break, we'll be back with Andrew Moran to figure out who holds the blame for Joe Biden's economic illiteracy.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
In this topsy-turvy world, it seems that spending a few $1 trillion here and there apparently costs nothing whatsoever. Zero, at least according to President Joe Biden. Top this off with a spirited defense from White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, and what we have is a recipe for debt. Just how can the administration claim that borrowing money and spending it cost the taxpayer nothing at all? Well, to help us answer that paradox, we're joined by author and economics guru, Mr. Andrew Moran. Welcome aboard, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me, Joe Biden tweets that the $3.5 trillion human infrastructure plan will cost precisely $0. Have I gone mad, or is he right?
It's complete poppycock. I mean, it's just complete nonsense. And obviously, he didn't write that tweet. Someone of his communications said it, but then he said it in a speech to the White House. So obviously, he has no clue what he's talking about. But let's dissect this for a second. Let's say he's right. Let's say that he's going to get all the money he wants when it comes to the $3.5 trillion. He's going to raise all this revenue from all these different streams. That's still taxing the public. That's still charging the public for all these supposed public goods. So it's not free. It's not him just giving all this wealth away. It's confiscating wealth from the public. Now, will he get $3.5 trillion? Probably not. From the estimates I've seen, both from the left and the right think tanks, the most conservative one I saw is that he's going to get $2.3 trillion. Not the $3.5 trillion. So obviously there's going to be a massive deficit occurring with that spending bill. And the Congressional Budget Office, they already say that the infrastructure bill is going to add $300 billion to the deficit. So all these spending plans he has, it's not going to be paid for. It's all going to cost taxpayers money and add to the growing debt.
Well, let's speak about those taxpayers for a moment, because Joe Biden has said that with his tax rises, that it's not going to impact anybody who earns less than $400,000 a year, or no household that earns less than $400,000 a year. So obviously a lot of people are thinking, well, maybe that's them. Maybe they're not going to be impacted by these tax rises. However, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki was defending the president's position, something that she seems to have to do more and more often nowadays, saying that it was absurd that the wealthy company owners would pass on the cost to consumers. Absurd. Now, am I living in bizarro world? Because I thought passing on costs to consumers was standard practice and has been since time immemorial.
Yeah, I mean, when I hear these opinions or these comments, it helps. I can't help but think of Murray Rothbard when he wrote in his book Anatomy of the State. He said that it's no crime to be ignorant of economics, but it's irresponsible to have a loud and vociferous opinion on economic subjects. I mean, this is Econ 101. When you have corporations, they pass the cost on to everything onto consumers. Now, they have to be competitive, of course, but when it comes to corporate tax rates, labor costs, raw material prices, everything gets passed on to the consumers. Just this week, Nike, Costco, they said that with the congestion going on the shipments and rising inflation prices, their customers are going to pay more for their goods. So this is just basic economics. What's going on at the White House? I mean, did Paul Krugman join the White House economic team or something?
Now, I do hate to continue with this litany of apparent economic errors, but what's the latest word on inflation from the Fed? And how could the White House have not seen this coming?
Yeah, this is perhaps my favorite economic story of 2021, because at the start of the year, everyone from saying there's not going to be any inflation. What are you talking about? You have no clue. You're just one of those crazy Austrian crackpots. And now it's saying, oh yeah, inflation's here. It's hot. It's going to stay here for longer. But don't worry, one day it will be transitory. So Fed Chair Jerome Powell, he spoke at the Senate Banking Committee on September 28th, and he was talking about, yeah, well, inflation is hot. It's going to be here longer. It's longer than we anticipated. How they got it wrong, I don't know how they could possibly see it. Liberty Nation's been writing about this since the early days of the pandemic when they passed that CARES Act, how all this new money would funnel into the economy and create massive price inflation. And then, of course, you have the economy reopening, so everyone's demanding everything at the same time. That was seen a long time ago. So I don't know if it's ignorance or ineptitude, whatever it is, but they really dropped the ball on this one.
Give me your analysis here, Andrew, please. How is it that we seem to be sinking into fiscal disaster? The economic iceberg dead ahead, and the captain of the Titanic, he just can't seem to steer away. Now, if I were a conspiracist, I'd have to conclude that this debacle, this financial economic debacle, was somewhat intentional, or they're incompetent. How do you see it, intent or incompetence?
I think it's a bit of both. America's finances have been on the downward since the Reagan years, or perhaps even one Jimmy Carter. The government spends more than it takes in. It may generate massive amounts of revenue, which it does, but it has a massive spending problem because politicians, they've mastered the art of kicking the can down the road. Every time they spend, they're thinking to the next election cycle. They don't want to make the tough choices. They don't want to make any sacrifices because they're afraid they're going to lose a certain percentage of the voting public. And their only solution to everything is to just to tax more. And of course, that's not a long-term sustainable path to take. I mean, you could tax Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Jim Rogers 100%. But that's only going to keep the walls of Congress, or the lights of Congress, on for I think 6 months. And then you take all their money, and then what? There's nothing else what else are you gonna take from? The middle class is already being squeezed. The low income, they don't pay much taxes, so you have to take from them. And then of course you have the most hideous tax of all, the inflation, because every new spending that a politician approves, that's going to be an inflation tax in future because they have no way to pay for it. Everything is deficit financed. Everything is done either by taxing, borrowing, or printing, and that's the moniker now of Washington.
Now, final question for you, Andrew, and I can't let you go without discussing toilet paper. Now, that's my specialty. It really is. Will Americans be forced to invest in bidets in the very near future, or is it all just scaremongering prompted by panic buying?
Yeah, it's those bidet special interest groups. They lobby on Washington. It's been all these
big bidet.
But I was writing about this the other day, talking about there's a lot of the big I think it was Costco. They're talking about they're already limiting toilet paper sales. So it's giving the impression that the consumer marketplace, they're bracing for shortages, but there are other shortages too. They're warning about paper towel shortages. Nike's warning about apparel shortages. So it's all adding up. Will it be a Mad Max situation as it was in March 2020? I don't know. When I see for instance, there's a saying among investors that if it hits CNBC or the Wall Street Journal, it's already too late. So when CNBC, when they're starting to report on this toilet paper shortage, it gives me an idea that it's not going to be as bad as they say, because last year nobody saw it coming. Nobody saw this toilet paper shortage coming. CNBC wasn't talking about it, and then it just happened out of nowhere. And then a few months later, CNBC was saying another toilet paper shortage is coming. It never did. So I think it's just a wait and see approach. In the meantime, get your bidet installed, stock up on your toilet paper, or use, as I did at March 2020, use some Kleenex.
Andrew Moran, thank you ever so much. Coming up soon on the show, we'll be asking whether SCOTUS can win, or is it doomed to be the whipping boy of the left and the right? But next up, we're casting a light on what happens down Mexico way as the border appears to have just plain disappeared. You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. And this week we offer a special thank you to those of you listening on KBKW 103.5 FM, the talk of Grays Harbor, Washington.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
In a case of political Murphy's Law on the border, it seems that everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. Not just this latest debacle with thousands of Haitians, not merely the more than 1.5 million illegal migrant encounters this year alone. Cages, child abuse, trafficking, rape. It has become one of the most dangerous places in the country, and yet no plan exists to fix it. People are beginning to ask, is border security a thing of the past? And are these constant problems just a circuitous route to open borders? Well, helping us answer these questions is Liberty Nation treasurer, national columnist, Miss Sarah Cowgill. Welcome aboard, Sarah.
Well, it's good to be here, Mark. What's going on today?
Well, I have questions to ask and questions aplenty. So the first one is all of these problems and no solutions. Is this really just open borders by the back door, or am I being paranoid?
You might be paranoid, but you might be right. I mean, being paranoid just means you're worried about something. So I would say that whether it's their intent or not, we have a porous open border along at least 3 of our states right now. Is it intentional? To some degree, some of it would be intentional, but they can't handle the load. They know they can't handle the load. And this administration is backpedaling and trying to please progressives on one side, please Americans on the southern border on the other side, and somehow handle it. They've made a complete mess of this whole mess. I mean, they took what was almost under control and have just screwed it up to the point where good luck. You've irritated and alienated your own border patrol. You have told we're not going to finish the wall. That was the latest thing. Not going to finish the wall. We're not going to plug the holes. That's what Border Patrol has been doing, plugging holes in the wall on after shift. You've got people, taking Haitians who really probably really do deserve a bit of a relief and maybe some refugee status, and cattle carring them into planes and shipping them back home. But then you still got thousands of people heading this direction and thousands of people sitting there, others just going through the holes. So this is a complete debacle.
Well, it seems that back in July, President Biden put together a plan. It was a 21-point plan for border control. Is this what following the plan looks like for the Biden administration?
The plan was 21 bullet points that said, create a group to look into this, create this. It was all about creating task force and reusing different resources, like pulling people off the border and finding other ways, to protect the border. And it's really, if you go back and look at it today, it's basically a blueprint of what not to do. It's exactly what they haven't done.
It certainly seems to smack of naivety looking back on what they really have failed to do here. And it just seems to be getting worse. I mean, at the moment, you've got a number of Border Patrol agents who are facing permanent suspension, unpaid suspension, because perhaps they don't want to or can't take the COVID vaccine as required by Joe Biden's mandate. So we're actually in the process of, along with hospitals in New York State, cutting back on the very people that are needed. What's going on with this?
You're looking at a group of people who have put their lives on the line for years and years and years in law enforcement. That's a tough job to have. If you look at the numbers, it's about 200 to 300 people trying to cross the border for each Border Patrol agent. That's a horrible, horrible upside down number. So number one, they're overworked. They're underpaid. They're extremely underappreciated by this administration, who has promised to make them pay for the bad optics of one photograph. And basically the agents are saying this administration has declared war on us. And so they're stepping up, they're mad. And this isn't going to help things if they all just say, well, we got the green flu, we're leaving. And, the more that this administration tries to put their campaign promises into play to please a handful of progressives and a whole bunch of, Democrats that have made this their issue. When President Trump was in office, it was all about kids in cages. It was all about these horrible things that were going on. Multiply that by about 300, and that's what you've got going on now. It's beyond ridiculous, and I'm not sure they can rein. I don't think they can rein any of this in. I think it's just going to overrun. And you've got Governor Greg Abbott in Texas, who's saying, look, if those agents get fired, state of Texas will pick it up and they will be back on the border and we will secure our border. So
why isn't this the biggest news story of the year? The complete collapse of the southern border. And yet it doesn't even get mentioned on the front page. Because it's worse than
it was in 2020. It's so much worse. And everybody campaigned on getting Trump out of office by how mean he was. You can't go back. You went from kids in cages in the Obama eras, who built the cages and put the kids in cages. Trump just kept putting kids in cages. And then you have them put in shipping containers. So really, what's the difference between a kid in a cage and a kid in a shipping container? And so you've got those optics. They can't report on that because that's worse than what it was. They can't report on the conditions at the border now because it's worse than what it was. It was supposed to get so much better. It was supposed to be the humanitarian relief that everybody was looking for. Oh, let them all in. Let's vet them fast. Let's get them in and out. It's so screwed up down there. They can't report it. If they report it, they all look like they were complicit.
Sarah,
so they have to just ignore it.
Are you suggesting that the fourth estate would purposely ignore stories just to protect their reputation?
I'm suggesting that. I'm not suggesting that. I'm telling you that's what's going on.
I thought that's what it was.
Not really a suggestion so much as a declaration of what the heck, guys. Come on, report the news.
It seems to me that perhaps neither side really wants to fix the immigration system completely. Since I was a wee young whippersnapper, I've heard politicians on both sides of the Atlantic talk about fixing our broken systems, because this is not just a problem in the United States. We have a similar issue in the UK with dinghy migrants or boat migrants, up to 1,000 a day just landing on shores coming from France. Recent reports suggest that DACA is making a comeback. Now, we also know that Joe Biden wants a form of amnesty or green cards, upwards of 8 million individuals, I believe. And there's obviously, as you mentioned, there's a sign above the southern border saying open to all, come on, come all. Now, there's an old saying, Sarah, and I'm sure you've heard it: a country without borders is no country at all. And it makes me wonder, when is enough immigration enough? How many people does the administration think that America can comfortably sustain and want to take in on a yearly basis or over a 10-year period?
Well, I think this administration, if they can let as many people in as they can, as long as they are Central and Southern Americans versus Haitians or Cubans, they will get them in, give them a card, and let them vote. That's their goal. But they know that you can't sustain this amount of people coming through. You can't have 200,000 people coming through a month. And that's just the ones we know about. So they know it's not sustainable. They're trying behind the scenes to come up with a way to get people to stop coming there. And they're trying to figure out how to vet as many people as possible. Now, the other thing is with DACA, if you will remember, Trump was trying to grant amnesty to a good chunk of the DACA people, and the Democrats blocked it. So now they're going to give amnesty to everybody. It's, we could have been doing this every year, a little chunk, bring them in, get them settled, bring them in, get them settled, instead of let them run loose. And holy moly goodness, we've got 8 million people trying to get in here. So I think if you had, if we had just taken on a more of a legitimate approach, they could just, feather them in, so to speak. And instead, it's just, this country can't handle just all of a sudden a whole bunch of people on welfare. It just can't. We are so broke right now. It's ridiculous.
Sarah Cowgill, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Right after this short break, we'll be talking liberty with Scott Cosenza. Why can't the Supreme Court catch a break? And what are the big cases on the docket? Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Liberty Nation here on the Radio American Network.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
SCOTUS is back. A new session set to get underway, but this time it feels a little bit different. In recent history, there's not been such vitriol reserved for the courts. The Democrats want it expanded. The media call it out on almost every decision. And based on the various narratives and spin, the American public are beginning to wonder if it's fit for purpose. So extensive are these attacks against the highest of high courts that a number of justices have taken to defending themselves in public. Is this normal? Is it damaging? And what does the Supreme Court have for us this coming session? Well, to talk liberty, we're here with the host of the Uprising podcast, constitutional attorney and author, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza. Welcome aboard, Scott.
Hi, Mark.
So, Scott, we've had Clarence Thomas speaking in public about his decisions and how he makes them. Amy Coney Barrett felt the need to do the same. Now, is this normal behavior for justices? The media suggests that it isn't, but I'm not so sure.
Well, justices are frequently quoted for remarks that they give. They don't remark as much as, a pundit on TV or the internet might, but they do live lives off the bench in the legal world. So these typically include in the springtime, you'll hear justices comment as they give commencement addresses, for instance, and throughout the year, they may go to legal conferences when they're not actively seated and hearing cases. And so this was a Notre Dame University event, I believe, and that's where both justices spoke. And I don't think that Thomas spoke out of turn or in any way that was somehow unique or earth-shattering. I mean, it is news when they address their own decision-making, certainly, but it wasn't earth-shattering what he said.
I want to run an analysis past you here, Scott, and give me your professional opinion on it. If the justices deliver for conservatives in their decisions, the left will insist that something has to change. If they don't, the right will say something has to change. Either way, is SCOTUS in trouble? Is it high noon at the Supreme Court?
Well, I think it's only in trouble, Mark, if the calls are taken seriously rather than the attempt at either gaining votes or just political power or fundraising, which I think most of them are. There's certainly some genuine calls for change or reform on both sides of the aisle, but a lot of what you see is just making hay for the sake of it, I think. And so, yes, the Supreme Court doesn't have, with the exception of some U.S. Marshals, I guess, maybe it doesn't really have any way to enforce its will. Except for through the other branches and through the body of Americans who respect those decisions, even if we disagree with them. And to the extent that that erodes significantly, well, then you're headed down the path of trouble. Absolutely.
By trouble, do you mean court packing or appointments?
All manner of mischief might befall the court if we see, approval and trust dip massively. There was a Gallup poll released recently that showed that the trust in the court is at its lowest point. Now, it's not like it dipped 100 points, but it did dip a significant number of percentage points for people who think that the court is apolitical and kind of respect their judgments. So now 40%, sometimes the lead is buried. 40% of Americans basically think the court does a good job. And then it's the other 60. Some of those folks think it's too liberal. Some think it's too conservative on both sides of the aisle.
Okay, so let's talk about this upcoming term. The format, it's a little bit different this time, right? And I believe that means that one of the results of this different format is that we're likely to hear a little bit more from Justice Clarence Thomas.
Well, not necessarily more than we have in the past year, but more than we have in the courtroom. So when the COVID pandemic hit, the Supreme Court went to an all-virtual environment where the litigators and also the justices were not in the courtroom and participating basically via like a Zoom call. And Mark, before the pandemic, and I don't know when this system went into effect, but it was certainly before I went into law school or probably was even born, and that was that while the advocates for either side of the case get a prescribed amount of minutes in order to discuss their arguments, justices can jump in at any time, and they often do, and they interrupt the litigants and they interrupt each other. Now, it's not a sort of free-for-all. It's with a design to getting towards exposure of certain legal points and arguments during the oral argument. Well, that went away during the pandemic. When the pandemic came in, the Supreme Court went to an all-virtual environment on Zoom, and what happened was they would go through each justice, basically in order of seniority, to find out if they had any questions. And during that Zoom break in the tradition, that's when Justice Thomas came to life. Now, for those who don't know, it's not just that Justice Thomas is quiet during oral arguments. He went over 10 years, Mark, without asking a single question during oral argument. So the man has a great capacity to remain silent during oral argument. But for those of us, and I count myself one, who are most appreciative of his mind and reasoning on the court, we certainly like it when he weighs in at oral argument. And we think we're going to see more of it as we go forward, because now they're going to do a hybrid where they have the usual free-for-all kind of jump-in thing like they used to do. And then after that, they're going to do a by seniority run-through. And it seems like we will see more Thomas in this, but we'll have to wait and see as the cases are argued.
So is this new format, is it going to benefit or hinder the cut and thrust that we expect in a lively courtroom, especially on such major constitutional issues, and also in helping the public understand the decision-making process, like how the justices arrive at their decisions?
Well, for the last part of your question, I have no idea about the how. I would suggest that people read the opinions themselves. Now, they're somewhat difficult to get through on occasion, but that's the best reasoning or laying out of the reasoning as to how the justices arrived, at least that they're telling us. Now, there are cynics on both sides who say, oh, no, that's not true. You just want to ban abortion or cut something or enact some other thing. And so, but that is our best information from the justices themselves about what led them to their decisions. As far as the back and forth kind of thing and whether we'll aid that, we're just going to have to wait and see, I think. I certainly am hopeful that we're going to hear more from Justice Thomas, and I think that it's different if you have to take the impetus to interrupt somebody to ask a question rather than somebody calling on you to say, do you have any questions, which is the new format. So it stands to reason that we will hear more from him and perhaps other justices.
Now, the two biggest cases that are coming up before the court must be the abortion case and the Second Amendment case. Now, with these two in particular, whichever way the majority rules, is the reputation of the Supreme Court going to lose? And if so, is it because the public fundamentally misunderstands the role of the court or some other reason?
Mark, to the extent that the public doesn't understand the role of the court, I think they're misinformed by the media, sadly. And, let's take this abortion and guns are certainly two of the cases and issues that I'm following most closely. Let's take that abortion issue for a moment. We recently had a situation where the Supreme Court rejected a motion for a stay to stop the implementation of a Texas abortion law. Now, what the Supreme Court didn't do was hear that case. And what I mean by that is when they hear a case, they accept briefs, they examine the arguments, they have oral arguments, and then they deliberate over that, and then they issue an opinion. That's not what happened. This was more like an emergency application. But I think if you look at the headlines and the popular big box media treatment of this issue, for most folks who are skimming these issues and not reading, 5 layers down, they just see the Supreme Court ruled that this was an okay law. Well, when you peel back the onion, you find out that that's actually not the case. What they said was they weren't going to grant this injunction, but they weren't ruling on the propriety of the law itself. And so we just have ourselves to blame, sadly, in the media for this kind of thing, which is why one of the reasons why we started LibertyNation.com, Mark.
Scott D. Cosenza, thank you ever so much.
Cheers.
And that's all we have time for this week on Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio American Network. I want to thank our guests, Dave Patterson, Andrew Moran, Sarah Cowgill, and of course, Talking Liberty's Scott Cosenza. But as always, you, the listener, deserve the most thanks of all for being here and making it all worthwhile. A final thought to leave you with. There's a problem-solving principle often attributed to Franciscan friar and philosopher William of Ockham. It goes, entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity. Or as more commonly phrased, the simplest solution is usually the most likely. When we consider the myriad debacles that are putting all Americans under such monumental pressure, it's a tough call between, is this happening on purpose as part of a grander scheme orchestrated by a shadowy deep state, or is the administration merely incompetent and weak? Perhaps it's time to apply the lessons of Occam's razor. But in the end, that might be an even more terrifying prospect. Until next time, thanks for listening.